So today we'll be talking about how to navigate the key updates for ISO 14155. Today I'm joined by Daniel Giroux, Richard Holbrook, and Victoria Cavendish. Today I'll be moderating the session. And just to give you a brief background about myself, I'm an orthopedic surgeon by training, having worked with notified bodies such as TÜV lately, and currently I work with Ecklevar MedTech as the chief medical officer, as well as the lead for the AI electronic data capture platform, Milo Healthcare. Hand it over to Danielle.
No, Victoria.
Yeah, no, oh yeah, we can introduce ourselves.
Yeah. Introduction. Sorry.
Yes.
I'm so sorry. I
No,
was
no.
confused. I thought you wanted us to get started. Okay, so I'm Danielle Giroux, and unfortunately, my name now I see on this slide is a little bit misspelled. There is an R in addition, but it's okay. It's not my name, it's my husband's name, so I'm fine with it. So I'm the convener of the ISO 14155, and I usually say I've been doing that since 2008. So I usually say I'm the guilty one. I have close to 40 years of experience in the medical device clinical arena. Followed the regulations from EN 540 to before the MDD to whatever. So one day I should retire. Yes, I know. But I'm still here, still very active, and I hope today that I can bring you some news on ISO 14155 on what's coming your way.
Wonderful. Richard?
Great, thanks, Gail. Nice to meet you all. My name's Richard Holbrook. I'm the head of clinical compliance at BSI, which is a notified body under the both medical device regulation and the IVD regulation. Prior to joining BSI, I was a cardiac physiologist in the UK and the NHS for about 15 years before moving into the regulatory space almost 7 years ago. Today, I look forward to talking to you all about how we look at ISO 14155 in terms of clinical investigations for conformity assessment and what's important to a notified body. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Richard. Dr. Victoria?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Victoria Cavendish. I am currently an independent consultant under Orpha Solutions, but I've been in and around the medical device industry degree for 25 years plus. So it feels like a long time. And Danielle, I don't think you should do anything apart from write a book about all your experiences that you've had. So my background started off in academia and the NHS. I've also worked in manufacturing companies and also on the CRO side of activities. So it's quite a mixed background. And I'm really pleased to be here today to talk a little bit about current state, but then also to look to the future, which I think is going to be really exciting. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. I'll just start with a sort of brief introduction, and then I'll hand it over to Victoria to take forward. Yeah. So that's myself again. Coming to what we are Ecklevar MedTech. We were founded in October 2020. We are a contract research organization, and we conduct clinical trials across Europe, both pre-market and post-market. While conducting these trials, we realized there was a deficiency in a good data capture platform, which was now is an AI enabled, and we developed a very in-house platform called Milo Healthcare to capture all the electronic data during your clinical trial. So these are therapeutic areas. So you can see orthopedics and spine constitute a large chunk of our work, along with interventional cardiology, wound care, and urology. So what is Milo Health? So it's an electronic data capture platform, which is AI enabled. It has a listening capability and is able to contextually reason and it can take actions depending on the data provided. So what does it do? So it finds and matches patients automatically to the relevant clinical trials, as well as it helps pushes the audio transcription into the EDC, and all the manual textual data inputted in the EMR is again pushed into the EDC through this platform. So the advantages are there's no integration required to the EMR, which is quite important given the hassles around integrating it to the EMR providers. Requires a very short training. It's available in many languages and it's scalable. So this is where we are currently in the era of 2025, and going forwards into 2026, we plan to have a liaison officer. It's MILO, which stands for Medical Interface Liaison Officer, which is more like an AI agent to help you with your clinical trial work. I think that's me here. I'll hand it over to Victoria.
So thank you very much. So hopefully the technology will be on my side and I can share my slide. So we're going from the future very much to look at kind of current state with ISO 14155. So let me just share my screen. It might take a second. It will take a second, obviously. Okay, let's see. Let's try that again. I apologize. I decided today was a day to move from a PC to a Mac, so I've already had a few comments on that. So bear with me. So while my slides are just loading, what I want to do is just kind of introduce the current state. So of course, we're all aware that we've been working under ISO 14155, the 2020 version, for quite some time now. And I just want to have a look at kind of where we are before we kind of move into the future. So the 2020 version of 14155 asks us to do a continuous risk assessment, which goes from study design right the way through execution and right the way into study reporting, to ensure that we're actually running studies which are ethically sound, valid, and regulatory compliant. So this is the main aim of what we're trying to do. The change in the 2020, of course, was that it introduced some concepts that to some would be a little bit more novel or new than what you would have seen before. So the section I really want to focus on is around section 6, and that's around the clinical investigation planning. And that's where this risk assessment or the risk management piece of the activity sits. And also, of course, crucially in Annex H, because now we're not only dealing with ISO 14155, which if you're in the clinical ops or clinical space, you're very used to, we're also now being asked to look at 14971, which is the risk assessment ISO standard for the actual device itself. So those are the two sections that I want us to look at today, and that's where Danielle is actually going to help us move forward into the future. So what it's doing is it's asking us to look at all the risks associated and actually performing a risk assessment. Now, to those in ClinOps, actually being asked to do a risk assessment could be in itself quite a new and novel concept. So previously, of course, we've been doing a risk assessment, but probably not in such a formal manner as we were being asked to do it now. And it's the fact that we've been asked to do the risk assessment through the whole execution of the study. So also when we're doing the planning piece. And what I want to look at today is how we take the output of some of the clinical evaluation and we can roll that into the kind of design of the protocol and then some of the knock-on effects. So it'll be a very quick touch, but this is what we're going to really look at. What we're also being asked to do now is look at risk tolerances. So when do we say enough is enough? How much risk is too much? How much risk are we happy to accept? And then what do we do once we hit that point? So what's it going to trigger? And of course, now I'm hoping that you're all starting to think around AEs, SAEs, SADs, etc., because that's naturally where we'll all start to think at this point when we talk about risk management. In the 2020 version of ISO, actually risk management for the first time was really split into two elements. So one was around looking about the actual process itself, so the actual process of running the clinical investigation. So it's everything that would happen. So take the device to one side for a minute, just leave that on one side, and let's look at the process. So how much risk, or if there's any risk, are we introducing by asking a subject to take part in a clinical investigation? And we have to look at the point from when we first interact with them, so when we start that informed consent process, right the way through the consenting, right the way through their enrollment, their time on the study, right the way to the end. So we have to consider the whole process. And of course, this is Now what's been introduced, because now of course we have the element of kind of quality and a quality management system around the clinical, separate to what's been happening within the manufacturer for the device, but now it's around the clinical investigation itself. So it's a kind of a change in a mindset in a way of how we're being asked to capture them. And what I've definitely seen a lot of companies do is around the clinical investigation process is actually that's where the standard SOPs, the standard templates, etc. will roll out. But we also have to be mindful there are different risks when it's pre-market, post-market, if we're looking at certain study designs, so if we're looking at randomized maybe versus observational. So it's good to have a kind of a generic starting place, but we also have to make sure that we tailor for each individual study that we're going to run. So that's one element of risk management under the ISO 2020 version. The other element that we have to be mindful of, which we've already been thinking about, is around the device itself. What we've been asked now is to actually look at the ISO 14971, which is our risk management or risk assessment for the actual device itself, and look at how we may take in the nature of running a study or running the study, how we're taking that device and maybe doing something different or using the device in a slightly different way. Because certainly if you're pre-market, your final device may be a very early iteration, it may be a prototype, it might not be the final version. And so we have to look at the actual ISO 14971. And then we also have to look at then what we're going to do differently. And that risk is what's going to be captured in the clinical investigation plan, the investigator brochure of your pre-market, your instructions for use, and also your informed consent form. And a key part of this risk assessment that we're doing around the device itself is also looking at how much training you might need to actually give a site, give the investigational site, because training on the device itself is actually a really key part of it. So these are the two components that we're working with. And I've probably, for some, started to use some acronyms or start to reference an ISO standard 14971 that some people may never have read. But we're being asked to work together with 14145 and the 14971 to kind of pull the process together. And for the duration of the study only, have a risk assessment which is applicable or related to the execution of the study. That risk assessment only is in place for the duration of the study, but it's still something new for us to think about. So what does it look like in real life, what we're doing at the minute? So as I said, it's an end-to-end, so from study design, how we identify the patients, how we enroll subjects, and then actually the whole time that they're on the study. So if we're looking at protocol development, so your clinical investigation plan development, then these are some of the key elements that you're going to be looking at. So we're going to be thinking about this, everything that we're going to do is going to be ethically justified, scientifically valid. Any risks related to the study. So are we asking for an endpoint which is going to be particularly invasive? How far away from standard of care are we going to be taking subjects during this study? And if by taking them away from standard of care, are we actually introducing then more risk to them because we need additional assessments, additional procedures performed? Then we have to look at the device-related risks. So we're already very used to in your clinical investigation plan, including the risk assessment, the risk-benefit analysis that we have to do. But of course, now we're also having to make sure we include the ISO 14971 element of things. So then we're looking at things like biocompatibility, device failure, malfunctions, etc. Also, of course, we also have to now start thinking about if there's an element of software or AI. So is there an element of risk introduced by having maybe AI involved in the study design as well? So also risks around patient related. So have we got a very particularly vulnerable group? Are they a particularly ill group of individuals? Are they relatively healthy? And actually making sure that our inclusion exclusion criteria are in place to give us the endpoints we need, of course, but also to make sure that there's minimum risk, to minimize as much risk as possible for those taking part in the studies. And now if we start to look a little bit wider, we also have to then start thinking about the safety and risk mitigation strategies that you're putting in place, but you might not be fully aware that you're putting them in place. So how we're going to do safety assessments. So we're looking at adverse events, adverse device effects, etc. This is maybe where we need some stopping rules. Maybe you have a study design that has stop-go criteria. Your pre-market, you might be your first in human. You might say, actually, if we hit so many SADEs, serious adverse device effects, then actually that would be the end. We would call a halt to the study, for example. So we have to start thinking about now the safety reporting, the safety elements of it. But we also have to put in risk mitigation when it actually comes to how we're looking with, again, as I said, the device itself. So do we need to make sure that sites and investigators are trained on the use of the device? Are there any tools for taking assessments or readings that individuals need training on? And also we have to then think about how do we make sure we get good data quality? So what activities do we need to put into place also to make sure we get good data? So it's a very clear a set of assessments. It's a very easy tool to use when it comes to EDC. We're very clear on how we're doing source data verification, etc. And of course, I've taken this as far as developing a really robust informed consent process, but actually we go much further because, as I said, the risk management piece that we've been asked to do under 2020 is end to end. So it's from the very start, the very design of the study, right the way through to when we do the final reporting at the end. So I pulled together a couple of examples of what this could look like. So now if we move into this, so one was the protocol development, and now we're going to look at the monitoring piece. So actually, a large element of what we do when you're monitoring a study is actually around risk management. So as we said, right from that study design, we looked at the actual study, the nature of the study, the design of the study, randomized, observational, etc. We looked at the endpoints we need. We're collecting only the data we need to answer the question that we've asked ourselves. But we also take risk management when it comes to this. We also take it down to site identification. So site ID, site selection, investigator selection, even. Risk management can go through all those steps and all those elements. When we look at initiation, because we've planned well in the early development stage of developing the protocol, we know if there needs to be site training on the device, if there needs to be site training on the EDC, on the TMF. So making sure there are site training logs in place, making sure there's a safety management in place, etc., etc. And then also, when it comes to the execution, it's around adverse events, reporting adverse events, protocol deviations. Protocol deviations in themselves suggest that something might not be quite right. Something's going maybe slightly awry at site. Something isn't quite as expected. So do we need they might be identified through routine monitoring. So do we need to address those with maybe a protocol amendment? Does there need to be a change that we need to be aware of because of the protocol deviations? And then, of course, we'll all get to our clinical study report. So the elements that it's introduced in the ISO 14155 2020 are fantastic. I think it's gone a long way to making risk management and risk assessment clearer and more outlined as what we need. But it still raised numerous questions, and I've still been privy to the comments that are come next. So I have heard people within ClinOps go, huh, what's ISO 14971? I've also been privy to conversations where actually within a manufacturing organization, there's a need for ownership. Someone wants to own it. So the 14971 process is always usually sat within R&D, research and development, maybe sat with a quality team, but suddenly now clinical are here. Clinical are going, well, we need to see it. We need to be part of it. We need to be, doing part of it. And so there is, within manufacturers, there's definite, potentially sometimes conflict over how do we still comply with ISO 14155, but include this element that we now need to around risk management and risk assessment. And there has been genuine confusion. confusion over, well, what does that mean? How do we do that? Do I need a tool? And actually teams working in silos and clinical teams creating a whole risk assessment when actually within the manufacturer they already exist. So there's been real confusion. So we've gone a long way down the road, but there's still more to come. And I'm very pleased now to hand over to Danielle, who's going to tell us a little bit more about what the future could look like for this risk management piece.
Thanks, Victoria. It's a very good lead in. Your last slide. Yeah, I know. It's that's why we said we need to update our ISO 14155. That's really a need for. So let me share my presentation if I can. There we go. Come on. And probably this is how you're going to see my full screen. Yeah. Okay. So tying into Victoria's presentation, we knew all these comments, and that's also why I pushed the revision of this ISO through. Even though we have loads of other ideas, we still want to improve as well. But I thought, no, this risk management, we need to fix it. There's too many, like you say. So just a quick introduction. I already told about myself. I'm the founder of MD Clinicals, a CRO for medical devices and IVDs. We really cover the whole span of clinical investigations, including medical writing. And this is me, a little bit an updated picture from my, I should not send the older picture. So anyway, ISO 14155. The date, we'll get back to that, soon to come. The FDIS will, I have sent it to the editing committee literally last Friday, to the editing, ISO editing, and they need usually a few weeks because it then needs to be translated into all the languages. So, but it's soon to become, and FDIS is really an important step. So what is changing? And I don't know, my slide is frozen. There we go. Now you can't hear me. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Danielle.
Okay, good.
I can see the slides as well. Yeah.
Certain shortcut buttons, they do. So the main reason for updating the ISO 14155 was risk management. We wanted to really clarify this much further. And clarifying that led to a whole lot of other sections to be updated, like the suspension, the early terminations and things like that. Annex H has been refined. Even the Annex F on reporting of adverse events was affected by it. And then we kind of looked also, every time we update, we look at the other GCP documents, and ICH was bringing out this section on estimates, which our biostatisticians on our team also said we should include it. We have a few updated definitions, not many, but a few. And we also made some changes in safety committees and some small changes in ethics and informed consent and a few updates here and there. So let me give you a summary of these because I can't give you all the little changes. Come on, move. So let's start with risk management because that's the most important one. So this is what we have now. So we have on the one side risks related to the investigational device, and on the other side, risks related to the clinical investigation. And then in the middle of all that, we have an MDCG document 2020-6, that 10-10, that comes out and tells us something about procedure-related risks without really defining what is procedure-related risk. And there was a whole confusion. Is it the procedure of the device? Is it the procedures of the CIP? And we went like, no, we need to clarify that. So from there, we went to not 2, but 3, and we made some changes. So the first part is still there, the risks related to the investigational device, except we make it broader. it was already broad, but we make it now clear with words how broad you need to consider it. So it's risks related to the use of the investigational device, meaning anything. If you need, I don't know, imaging to be able to place your device properly, and the patient for one reason or another during that procedure, there's an allergic reaction because the imaging is using a contrast medium or whatever, it's related to the use of the device, because without that imaging, you can't properly place your device. If on the other hand, you do a clinical investigation and at 6 months, because you have an endpoint, you think like, well, that endpoint, I can see it with that imaging, but the patient normally doesn't need that imaging. That is not related to the use of the device. That is a risk related to the clinical investigation, including risks related to procedures required by the CIP that are outside standard of care. So these are excluding risks related to the use of the device, which belong under 6.2.1. And then we kind of are like, yeah, but that's the CIP. So now we have that third category that is hanging out there. So we have now a 6.2.3 in that section that is risks related to the clinical investigation conduct. And that is also many of the things that Victoria was just stating is, do you have the right design of the protocol? Do you do monitoring properly so that you can avoid too many deviations and things like that? So these are these risks. So we've actually split it up in 3. So now if we talk about procedures, we are no longer talking about the investigational device purely in the wording of the standard, because we don't want that word procedure to be mixing up things, to be confusing the brains. So the ones to the investigational device are only the use of the investigational device, even if it is a procedure of the use of the investigational device, but we hope it will make it clearer. And we also got rid of some wording that was making it, we didn't realize it was a simple sentence where the comma was wrong and referring to Annex H for both the risks related to the investigational device and to the CIP procedures. And the sentence was just ill, and so we ill constructed. And that's where you realize that in a standardization writing, you really need to weigh word by word for people to not getting confused. So what I saw in practice then was people sending me emails saying, we don't know, it doesn't work, the 14971 for the procedures of the clinical investigation plan. And I'm like, why are they using that? It's like trying to fit a square tube in a round hole. It doesn't fit. So we have now made it clear also that Annex H is only about the risks related to the use of the device, but not the risks related to the CIP procedures. The CIP procedures has also a risk management process or a risk management considerations, but you don't have to use 14971 for that, because 14971 is really built to consider the risks of the use of the investigational device. I hope it will make it clear. So Annex H, sorry, Annex H was updated a little bit. It seemed that also some confusion was that Annex H had possibly 2 or several rounds, where if something happens during the clinical investigation that is unanticipated, you need to go back to your risk management from 14971 and consider, and your second round kind of doesn't fit completely in our diagram anymore. So we have now 2, and I hope the lines we left in the colors, I hope the lines make it clear, is before starting the clinical investigation and after suspension of a clinical investigation, where you have gone back to your 14971 activities again. So they may be different. Another thing that we've updated both in the standard and in Annex H is that you need to establish your risk acceptability thresholds proportional to the clinical investigation sample size or population. If we talk with our friends from risk management who do the 14971 day in, day out, they consider risks related to the full target population. our population is very small. It's only the population of the clinical investigation. So the percentages may change. So work with your biostatistician if you need to change those percentages. So you don't stop a study because you've reached the threshold, or you omit stopping a study because you haven't reached your thresholds, because your percentages of risk acceptability are not proportionate to your study. So those are the two things that we have changed. Obviously, this whole discussion led to, okay, suspension or premature termination, how do we word that? Not a lot has changed there. What we just want to make clear in our standard now is that, yes, when you suspend the study, you don't necessarily suspend the whole study. And the same goes for termination. Because it might, when you suspend the study, you usually suspend the use of the device, but not the full clinical investigation. You continue to follow up patients who have already been treated. So this is what we're trying to make clear in our new standard. And then so obviously we still need to provide a justification for restarting necessary amended documents, and this is where we have partially resumed. So when the risks of the use of the investigational device are deemed unacceptable, the study may continue with a follow-up of already treated patients, but you don't include new ones. So we wanted to distinguish all these. It took us quite a while. It took us really quite a while to get this worked out, so it was clear enough. So I hope you will follow it with the new wording. So premature termination can, when it's related to the device, is unacceptable risks related to the use of the device, and everywhere we've updated the wording to the use of the device. No corrective actions can be applied to secure patient safety, and corrective actions affect the validity of the clinical investigation. It may be that you could, but your corrective actions are such that it doesn't make sense to merge all the patients in one analysis. So you would close down that study and start a new study with new criteria where you can, again, obtain homogenic data that lead to your clinical evidence. So always, whether you do premature termination or suspension, a continued monitoring of already enrolled subjects with considerations of benefits for allowing follow-up as per CIP. Obviously, if there is no benefit, sometimes you do stop the study completely. The sponsor remains responsible. We really want to hammer on it because there's too many sponsors that say, I wash my hands, I have CE mark, I'm done with it. And the PI or designee must obviously promptly inform the subjects. We had that already. In terms of adverse event classification, furthermore, to try and clarify what MDCG is confusing our brains with, we have added, you remember this table that we had? It has slightly been updated. And we have added a blue site. And obviously, when we spoke about that in the working group, like Japan and the US, they don't use that blue site. For them, that blue site are just adverse events. They don't specifically say, oh, it was related to a CIP procedure that was outside routine practice. For the insurance, it's important though. But so
Daniel,
for you.
So, sorry, Daniel, I think people are struggling to see your slides. If you can just not share and unshare and share it again, if you can just try that.
Yeah, sure. Let me try again.
Yeah. I was trying on my end to send everyone the presentation, but
maybe let me put it on a different screen. I don't know. There. That screen. Can you now see it?
I can, but I don't know. Let's see if others. Oh, yeah.
No.
I think we had a thumbs up.
Yeah. Sorry about
think-
that.
I think
Okay.
few can see it, few can't see it. So I think it could be a lag issue. I'm really sorry, but we'll send the slides across to everyone and the recording.
So people can't see it again. I must be
think that-
doing something wrong.
But there are a few who can see it, Daniel, along with me, and I think, but for some
Which
it's
is
not.
strange. Okay.
Try again, and if not, then we'll share the slides at the end. I think just be mindful that people can't see the slides. Maybe you could give a better overview, and we'll try to take screenshots and put it.
I'll try that. It's like at the radio trying to describe a picture.
Yes.
Okay. So again, let me put it in slide mode and come on. Yeah.
I can. Hopefully others can slowly, maybe. Yeah, I think there are more thumbs up this time.
Okay, maybe I should.
I think we carry on, Daniel.
We carry on. Okay.
We can, yeah.
So I was talking about that blue site, which is really the blue site is specific for European regulations. So to make the other regulatory geographic areas happy, we put a note saying you may not always have to categorize the part of CIP required procedure outside routine practice related. So this is what that blue side, and I really insisted, I hope that ISO allows me to keep the blue side because ISO doesn't like to use colors in standards. The same thing is also for the Annex F flowchart, and I hope you can see that one, where we also have a blue side with the same options. It is, okay, if it is non-serious adverse event, then you ask an additional question. Could it be related to CIP required procedure outside routine practice, but other than the use of the device? And if it is yes, then it should be an AE, non-serious, related to that CIP procedure. And the same for serious adverse events. I hope it will help a lot of discussions in Europe, at least, for classifications of adverse event, because that has been a struggle, but our regulators want it, so no choice. So in the adverse events, we didn't change a lot, except the definition of adverse device effect has also been affected by that related to the use of the investigational device. So it's a small little word change, but hopefully it makes it clearer. But in the section 7.4.2, we do allow companies or people writing protocols considering clinical investigations to, prior to starting the study, consider certain adverse events that are not reportable, meaning things like elective procedures or something like that have nothing to do with the study. Otitis of kids that undergo cardiac procedure or it's like that. I mean, child diseases that have nothing to do with the cardiac procedure, hopefully not. So that we've added that. Hopefully that will clarify. And then the famous estimates. Everybody in our working group estimates what the heck we're like non-biostatistician. What the heck is this? Even though estimates is not necessarily biostatistics thing, it influences the statistics, but it is something that is defined by us, and we do this already. It's all those things like age of patients, gender maybe, or a certain comorbid, a certain disease that the patients have that can influence the study. And you need to identify those very early on because they can influence even the study design. It might be that they are so strong that you need, I don't know, a randomized study or so you really do this upfront. And then you disclose those with the biostatisticians, you train them on that, and they will take these estimates into account in their statistical calculations and also in the analysis, like missing data, things like that. So don't get scared by the word if you're not familiar with it. And we also do it step by step. So estimates for the time being are in text that is non-normative, just informative. We tell you this might be good that you do this, but it is not normative yet. Sometimes you need to make little steps. Otherwise, people will just refuse the standard because they don't understand, they're not ready for it. This is the psychological part of writing a standard. The definitions, as I said, adverse events, we have updated the use of the device. We have a new section and a new definition on clinical events committees. We already had DMC or DSMB, however you want to call it, but we didn't have anything on the clinical events committee that does the adjudication to ensure some homogenic approach to adverse event data. We have changed the definition of clinical performance to align, and I think we align with MDR. And then we have introduced computer system, but it was already electronic data management systems or something like that, but it applies to the whole computer systems. So it was a comment that made it much clearer if we changed it to definition to name it computer systems. So the sectional safety committees, in regards to the DMC, we've added defining stopping rules, and it might be something that you have experienced over the past years. A lot of competent authorities are asking you to add those stopping rules in the protocol. Now, they are normally something that you define, but a lot of competent authorities think that the DMC should already have their input, which they do have a point. And it is a risk management point of the conduct of your clinical investigation. And then the clinical events committee has a new definition and each section on its own with the responsibilities, which I hope you will appreciate. Under ethics, there are a few little changes here and there, but not major. But one that is important to note is deviations versus amendment. We have this text that you say, well, you need to report all your deviations to the ethics committees, but we also have text saying you need to request a deviation to the ethics committee if you want to make a deviations from your protocol. Now, some of our regulators in Europe came back and they said, well, if you request a deviation to an eligibility criteria, that is not acceptable. That's a protocol amendment. It is not a deviation. So those patients that physicians sometimes say, oh, can I deviate from the protocol because the patient is just this and that, you should amend your eligibility criteria to let those patients in the study, not just a quick deviation approved by the sponsor. Yes, we allow you to deviate from the protocol. The thing is, the competent authorities also think this is a risk management perspective, because your data, your patient population need to be the full patient population as you will target on the market. And if you start making deviations here and there from your protocol, your population may not correspond anymore to your target patient population. So I think this is an important point for you to take home. Now, I had to shorten this because I can talk for 2 hours. Actually, I have a long presentation on WMDO. If you are interested in really knowing, wait for maybe a week or so, I'll update it to the latest version. So FDIS, I said I have circulated, I think within the next 3 to 6 weeks, you will have it published. What you need to realize is that an FDIS stage only allows editorial changes, meaning whatever is in the FDIS, only edits can be made, no technical changes anymore. So the FDIS can really be used as a final document. It is a final draft, that's what it means. And you can start updating your SOPs, so you gain a little bit of time. A lot of people are asking me, oh, but when a new standard comes out, do we have a transition period? No, it comes out, it's there. And it will be considered as gold standard, whether it's harmonized or not, because we don't look at harmonization anymore. It's stalked again for some legal reasons. And again, our ISO 2020, which was ready to be harmonized in 2020, but still has not been harmonized for one reason or another. We always fall off the table. I don't know why, in a bin or whatever. But we're again stopped for legal reasons that have nothing to do with our standard. It's all standard harmonization has been stopped again. It's very frustrating for us, but we do consider that the latest versions of our standards are the gold standard, and those are the ones you need to use. For the 2025 version, the Annex H has, Annex Z for harmonization has followed the document side by side. So hopefully it will go faster. But of course, if they invent new legal things and in Brussels, nothing we can do about it. Just wanted to say, if you do want the full course, we have it on WMDO, which is a website with e-learning. And then if I can exaggerate of my time, I would like to announce ICEPS. ICEPS is the International Clinical Evidence Professional Society. And we will really, within the next 2-3 weeks, announce it on LinkedIn. We've put together, it was an initiative of me, it was an idea I had since many years, but I couldn't do it on my own. And we're now 5 or 6 people that put our heads together to get it started. It's been incorporated. It really needs to be international. We want to gather the whole clinical community, not only from industry, but also from regulators. Richard, you're more than welcome. From competent authorities, from the hospitals, from reimbursement, all players that have anything to do with clinical evidence. So please, if you are up for it and want to volunteer and help us putting programs together, activities together, please contact me, because we're really going to make it happen. And that's it. Thank you so much. Now I'm going to stop sharing, and I think the next looking forward to hear what Richard has to say about our ISO.
Thank you, Danielle, and yeah, thanks again for the invitation to come along today to present. I know some of you have struggled to see the screen. I did take some screenshots of Danielle's presentation to try and help you follow along, so hopefully you're able to see those. I'm hoping that people can see my slides on this. So I'm conscious of time, but I'll just start by saying that yeah, pretty much today I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of the notified body in the conformity assessment in relation to ISO 14155. And what I think we've heard a lot about the development, design and following the standard, but from a notified body's perspective, our involvement really is quite limited when it comes to the fact that somebody presents the data from a clinical investigation that's been conducted to ISO 14155. And the first aspect is really for us to make sure that the data has been collected in an ethical way, but that means for us about confirming the validity of the data. And that's something really important to a notified body, is how that data has been collected, and does the validity of that data evidence itself through the collection, the protocols, and has in terms of the adherence to the standard. We also confirm that whether appropriate documentation is present from the standard. You'll see that within the standard there is a list of lots of documents that are required to conduct the clinical investigation, to start, close, etc., from plan to closing. And we as notified body have certain documents that we will focus on, and I'll go through some of those today that might help you. We'll also, part of our role really is just ultimately then, once we know that the data has been collected in a validated method, is that then we can make that decision as to whether or not that data is sufficient. And that's kind of the process that goes on in the notified body in terms of confirming that data. And when we think of sufficiency of data, we always think of quality and quantity. So some of the things that obviously the notified body want to consider in relation to the standard is around ethical considerations. For example, consent obviously being a popular one. We as a notified body might ask for things such as evidence of consent forms. We don't ask to see the actual consent forms because obviously that's private information, but we may ask for a sample of the consent form, for example, as well. One of the things obviously in relation to the new MDR is about vulnerable patient groups. So again, we will ask questions about whether they've been protected. One of the things we do see as well is ensure, or one of the things we might ask is around ensuring whether the study participants have been able to participate from free from undue pressure. And I'll tell you a story that, it wasn't that long ago at the notified body where, we did receive a study from a part of the world where essentially prisoners were offered a reduced sentence if they were to participate in the study. And so those sorts of things, are obviously no-goes. That's an extreme, of course, and something that we as notified bodies will look into in terms of details. One of the things as well, yes, we don't have EUDAMED, but one of the things we do look for as well is to make sure that the clinical investigation protocol and sometimes results, if available, is made public as well. And that's really important from our perspective in terms of meeting the requirements of the regulation, but also adhering to the standard. And then when we're thinking about the validity of data, we're thinking about whether it's free from bias, the methodological approaches that have been used, and have serious adverse events been independently verified. Of course, that's really important from our perspective to ensure that the impartiality of that data collected is adequate to support the conclusions. One of the big things as well that often manufacturers sort of struggle with is around the fact that we know that over 3 or 4 years there could be amendments made to the clinical investigation protocol, and that's perfectly fine. But we need to make sure that those processes in place that to allow for those amendments have been conducted appropriately, and there's a good audit trail to those, differentiating what the differences are and the rationale and reasons behind those changes. And of course, the original protocol versus an amendment, we will ask for all versions of those as part of the notified body assessment. And of course, clinical investigation plan being statistically verified as well is important in terms of the power of that data. So if we look, for example, in the MDR, and this is where the notified body is obviously looking to make sure for CE certification that we've got the requirements in the regulation, but sometimes if a study is conducted in adherence to ISO 14155, where those links are. So ultimately, we as a notified body do think of recognised ethical principles, meaning the Declaration of Helsinki, and you'll see that there's a link to ethical considerations here within ISO 14155 that's currently available. One of the requirements around the MDR, of course, is that there is an appropriate plan of the investigation, that the actual study design is appropriate to the devices that you're going to be looking at or conducting your study on. And again, within the standard, we see a reference to that as well in terms of the appropriateness of the design and conduct of the clinical investigation, and ensuring that the design of it is done by educated parties and qualified parties as well. We also think about patient populations should be representative. And again, we have a requirement in the MDR, but we look to ISO 14155 to give us that aspects to ensure that the purpose of the population that you're conducting the clinical investigation in is truly representative of the intended purpose and indications for your device. We also look at patient numbers in terms of, as I said, statistical validation of a study to make sure that it's powered sufficiently in order to draw conclusions to those endpoints. And again, requirements in the MDR link up with requirements in the standard as well. One of the things that we often find here is that if you use complex statistics, then often that for a notified body means that we have to involve a biostatistical expert, and that's often just to verify the results. So that sometimes can add a few weeks to a review time as well. And of course, you should always make sure that you are yourselves involving biostatistical experts in terms of designing your clinical investigations. One of the perhaps big changes for which I think considered in the MDR is the fact that under the directives in the old system, we often used to see many endpoints that were actually safety related. And here you see in the MDR talking about primary endpoints that should be appropriate to the device and clinically relevant, and really should consider performance factors as well. And again, the standard aligns to that in terms of what we're looking for and our expectations in terms of making sure those objectives and endpoints are clinically meaningful to the device under evaluation. And of course, length of follow-up and intervals. Again, it should be appropriate to the procedures that are used to perform the clinical investigation should be appropriate to the device under investigation. And that's really important that, again, there is an appropriate length of study and duration and particularly follow-up times during the study in order to ensure that the data that's being collected is representative of the device under evaluation, particularly where risks to the patient might be occurring through the different life cycle of that device in the study. And again, you see that referenced within the standard. What I would say about the standard as well is that it's not just for pre-market clinical investigations. I think we see it as a really good tool to look in, even in designs of post-market clinical follow-up studies, to consider how those aspects. Granted, there will be some things that are not applicable in the post-market phase that might be applicable in a pre-market phase, but it does give you an opportunity to think about those things. One of the other areas that we're often seen as notified bodies as we transition over this period to the MDR is a lot of retrospective studies being performed. And again, there are still elements of ISO 14155 that are still relevant to those aspects. And I think, from a notified body perspective, we really do see the purpose of ISO 14155 enabling manufacturers to conduct clinical studies outside of Europe. There was often, I have to say, for a few years when the MDR came out, there was a myth. And that myth pretty much was something that was kind of that, if you're going to do a clinical investigation for MDR, it had to be in the EU, and that is not true. You can do clinical studies outside of the EU to support your conformity assessment and your CE marking. Of course, when you go outside of the European Union, there are sometimes some considerations, and notified bodies will also be asking questions about studies that are performed outside of the EU in terms of the considerations to the patient population. And the first thing, of course, is physical differences. There are height differences, for example, across the world. I often reference the Netherlands as being the tallest nation, and there are other nations which have a much lower height average across their population. And some of those things do matter, sometimes they don't. But for you as a manufacturer, you need to consider that when gathering data in a study from outside of the EU. The second aspect as well is it's about actual medication regimes. I often think as well about coronary stents. When you put in a coronary stent into a patient, the stent is part of the therapy for the patient. The ability for the stent to behave and conduct itself in an appropriate way and to reduce the risk of thrombosis or clots is actually sometimes down to the medicinal regime that supports that. So if you were doing a study, for example, outside of the EU, and patients are going on to medicinal regimes to support the implant, then you need to make sure that, for example, those drugs and that care pathway is very similar in the EU, or there's availability of those drugs and care pathways in the EU to show that that device does have a similar safety and performance aspect outside of the EU. It is also worth noting that location and expertise of the specialists, again, in some parts of the world, different professions do different things, and that's sometimes important to think about those educational pathways that people might have had in other areas. And that's sometimes helpful when you come to the EU with your study data, is just making sure to consider those elements, even things like institutions, how those are conducted. I often give cardiology references, but that's my background. But some centres, for example, do not have, they might have a cath lab to put stents in, but on site they may not have a cardiothoracic surgical unit. So if something goes wrong, for example, patients have to be transported to another hospital for that procedure. So there are things that can actually have influence on the study data. I'm conscious of time, so I just want to leave you with this quote, which I think is very fitting in the context of clinical evaluation and also in the consideration of clinical investigations. Hopefully that was helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for highlighting the notified body's perspective on ISO 14155. I think we have a few minutes to answer a few Q&As. Let me just, so let's start with the first one. So is there any room for retrospective study in clinical investigation? That is a retrospective study. Can it be a clinical investigation? So I think you touched upon that, Richard. It's from Roberto.
Yeah, So if you look at, there's an MDCG guidance document that talks about clinical investigations. It's a Q&A document, and in there it says that retrospective studies cannot be considered clinical investigations. But our understanding of that interpretation is that there are certain parts of the MDR that could never apply to a retrospective study. For example, maybe gaining consent. Competent authority approval is sometimes not required in those situations. So in that situation, we believe that that guidance document is highlighting the fact that the interpretation of the MDR means that prospective studies will meet the requirements of MDR and considered clinical investigations, but still retrospective studies can be used for pre-market CE submission, and we see lots of those, particularly conducted under the current transition where people are going back to get data.
Okay, thanks.
I would agree with that. And also certain parts, even for retrospective studies, certain parts of ISO 14155, in terms of how you analyze the data and so on in Annex A, they should be followed as to avoid bias in your analysis already. So I think it's important to use that data.
Okay. Another question, are there any conflicting issues between ISO 14155 and MDR? So I think, Daniel,
this is why we have to write this Annex Z.
Okay.
So the Annex Z is a document that where we need to point by point compare MDR to, or compare our document to MDR. And yes, there are a few, because our document is an international document, they're not conflicting. They're just explained in a different way, sometimes use slightly different words, but all in all, we are harmonizable. Once the document is back on the right desk.
I think probably the last one for today. Is the CEC always an external committee from external experts / medical experts? I think.
Well, we do. I do think we do mention in the new text that it is an independent committee, which means that independent, we define it in our standard, is independent from the sponsor and the investigators. Definitely, it should not be participating investigators that also adjudicate, because that doesn't make sense. But we also see sometimes for smaller studies or post-market studies that the adjudication is done internally at the sponsor. It depends how critical your as long as you can prove to the notified bodies that your data are credible and there is not too much bias.
Yeah.
And I've and I was going to say I've certainly seen in practice a whole selection of variants there about how, especially for small studies, a whole section of variants, maybe other investigators, you know, a whole variety of approaches for what that kit can look like.
I think just following on from that, will CEC still be able to conduct the sponsor assessment?
Well, here's the thing. The sponsor always has an assessment because the sponsor has a regulatory assessment for reporting purposes. The CEC should actually have a clinical assessment. That's why they call the Clinical Events Committee. And we have seen that in some parts, I have an example from the Swiss competent authorities. And I don't know, because I'm living in Switzerland, all problems with Swissmedic come to me. I don't know why, but where a company said, yes, but Swissmedic, because we are in a pilot study, they want us to consider everything device related. Obviously, then they bring that to the Clinical Events Committee, and the Clinical Events Committee, yeah, but we are cardiologists, we know it all. What does Swissmedic have to go interfere with our opinion? And this is where you have no choice. You know, either you create your regulatory assessment, and that's what I said to these people at that time, which is done by the sponsor, and also your clinical assessment done by your Clinical Events Committee. And you just report it all. Swissmedic, you want it, here it is, you know, deal with it. But yeah, there are these different components, and the sponsor has the responsibility of the regulatory component. Hopefully with this blue side in our ISO 14155 now in Annex F, it will make things easier.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add? I think I'll conclude the presentation. No?
No,
Okay.
just to know that ISO 14155 updates will not stop with these FDs. So these FDs will be one update, but we already continue with many other ideas. So if there are still things you're struggling with, I hate to say it, but yeah, okay, write me an email or go to your national standardization body, but you can also write me an email. I guess that's my faith.
Careful
You'll
there,
be-
Danielle.
Yeah, you'll be receiving a lot of emails.
I am.
Thank you, everyone, for this sort of wonderful, insightful presentation. I'm sure we touched upon all the topics which were burning out there. And yes, thank you again. We hope we answered all the questions. If there's anything, you can always write to me, and I'll try to